Hello, my loves. I am so excited to be here with you today. I'm freaking out on the inside. Hopefully, it doesn't look like I'm freaking out on the outside. I want to start today by offering my most sincere thank you to all of you for being here, but definitely to Men at War for including me in this incredible festival. I am overwhelmed with gratitude and excitement. I'm a huge fan of Women in Warp, and it is a deep honor to be here amongst all of these really awesome shows. So thank you so much for being here, and let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Dr. Michelle Foss, but I go by M. Foss, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And today we are going to be talking about a very special episode. That phrase has a little bit of an additional meaning when we're talking about television, right? But it is a very special episode of Voyager. It is a season 5 episode, and it is called Extreme Risk. It features one of my favorite characters in all of Trek, and that's Bolana Torres. First of her name, mother of being misunderstood, the queen of the warp core, the engineer that was promised. I hope you forgive me for mixing my fandom metaphors, if you will. All right, so this is technically your first appointment with the TV doctor. And if we can advance the slide, that would be awesome. Okay. Okay. All right. Let's see. That might be something that I need to do. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Oh, I wonder if I do this, that will work. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Oh, and then I can't say, okay. So we are going to be talking about your first appointment with the TV doctor. I'm assuming that many of you are unfamiliar with my show, so I would like introduce myself before we get started, and I hope that this is your first appointment of many. I'd like to welcome you to the TV Doctor. This is a podcast based on the idea that television has the power to heal some of the wounds that we pick up just by existing in this wild, wild world of ours. I am the TV doctor, and while I'm not a doctor on TV, I play one in real life. I'm a PhD kind of doctor, not a physician. So the prescriptions that I write are of the mediated variety, and you all have fantastic insurance to be my patients. This podcast is a place where I get to merge my professional life, my job as a professor who studies and teaches this stuff, with my personal passion for the topic of representation in television and other media, and my real desire to be of actual help to as many people as possible. I'm here to let you know what you should be watching to feel better about your life. In each episode, I offer one recommendation that I call my over-the-counter. Think of it as like a television multivitamin, something that everyone should watch regardless of diagnosis. I also do a segment called Second Opinion, in which I chat with a guest who's an expert on the show I'm recommending or the topic that I'll be talking about. And finally, I typically do a segment called Urgent Care, in which I respond to letters from the audience, basically. And I offer prescribed shows or episodes for very specific questions that they ask. And that's what we're going to be doing today, an urgent care episode that I would like to prescribe for someone who thinks that maybe depression has found its way into their life in any number of ways. Again, I have to mention that I am not a medical doctor, and as magical as television is, it cannot replace the care of a well-trained professional. So I encourage you to use my thoughts here as a catalyst and a conversation starter, and to seek out actual help should you determine that you or a loved one needs it. Before we get started, let's go ahead and discuss the 500-pound targ in the room. You may have noticed that the TV Doctor is not a Star Trek podcast, but Star Trek finds its way into so much of what I do, and it's definitely part of my origin story. When I was a kid, my mom actually encouraged me to watch Star Trek, the original series, and learn more about Spock to learn about being mixed race. I wrote my master's thesis on Star Trek: The Next Generation. I wrote my dissertation on Deep Space Nine. And if I turned around my computer, you would see that I have a full whiteboard of ideas for papers that I could write on Discovery alone. So I'm the daughter of a proud Trekkie. I consider myself a Trekker, and my 3-year-old daughter loves 2 things in this world: Marshall from the Paw Patrol and the Starship Enterprise, the 1701D to be precise. So with my Trek credentials now on display, I don't want us to have to wait any longer to get to our purpose. And that is, what do we learn from Star Trek Voyager's 3rd episode of the 5th season? And that is extreme risk. All right. So in extreme risk, let's just start with the most basic of recaps of this episode. So a few episodes prior, Bolana learns that pretty much her entire Maquis family has been wiped out. It's an incredibly traumatic loss for her, for clear and present reasons, right? But also because Bolana carries a lot of guilt that she wasn't there to fight with them. So knowing what we know about Bolana, we would expect for her to react with rage and throwing things and biting people's heads off, figuratively, of course. But instead, she withdraws. She seems very distant in all of her relationships. She also starts fooling around with the holodeck's safety protocols and putting herself in situations where she could be seriously injured. So ultimately, her colleagues and loved ones come to understand what it is that's going on, and they intervene, which, through television magic, snaps Bolana back into gear. And even in the midst of an incredibly vulnerable and raw moment for her, she manages to save the day with some creative engineering and the promise of banana pancakes for a job well done. If you hear a little bit of sarcasm in my voice in this part right here, you're not wrong. And I would just encourage you to stay tuned. All right. So as I mentioned, I'm not a physician. I have no medical training. I'm not that kind of doctor. So I thought it would be responsible of me to secure a second opinion. And so I consulted with my friend, Dr. Chicote Rogers, and she is a licensed clinical psychologist here in California. And I essentially asked her to take a look at Bolana's case file for me. If it's been a while since you've seen this episode, I'll remind you that Bolana has been, like I said, fooling around with the holodeck, and there's a pretty serious accident that happens when she is doing that. And that accident never would have happened had she left the safety protocols where they were, but she gets hurt pretty severely, and she wakes up in sickbay where the doctor, the EMH, diagnoses her with clinical depression. Those words. But Dr. Rogers had a bit of a different take on what she saw. And here's what she said. Whenever patients present in my office with self-harm behaviors, it's not always the case, but typically self-harm is associated with a diagnosis called borderline personality disorder, or BPD. While Bolana may not actually have that diagnosis, it certainly sounds like she has a lot of the traits. Here are some of the things you mentioned that stood out for me regarding BPD. Number 1, the self-harm we talked about. I will add this though. What patients typically share is that their self-harm isn't always attention-seeking or an attempt at suicide. Often, folks self-harm because they feel numb on the inside and use the cutting to actually feel something. Other times, they do it because their emotions are so far out of control and the cutting allows them to shift their attention away from their emotional pain and redirect it to their physical pain. Other times they say that because the intensity of their emotions are so difficult, or because the intensity is so difficult to control, self-harm usually allows for a release and helps to take the pressure off. This was sounding familiar to me. That sounded just like Bolana. Number two, folks with BPD have troubles with regulating their emotions and can often be wildly unpredictable in their moods. They can often be grouchy, irritable, and angry, and can go from there to sadness and despair, and then become really anxious, whether it's in response to a specific stressor or it can happen spontaneously. That can often be confusing to other people because their moods and corresponding behaviors can shift pretty dramatically without warning. And then number three, they are triggered easily and are incredibly vulnerable to anything related to loss, whether that loss is real or imagined, or comes from the loss of a relationship, a death of some kind, most any rejection, or if there is the threat or perceived threat of a potential loss. The notion of rejection can become incredibly painful for them, and they can engage in seemingly dramatic behaviors to avoid the loss or in reaction to the loss. Okay, end quote. So Dr. Rogers basically explained to me that all of these indicators, all of these behaviors that pop up for Bolana in this episode, they can definitely point to depression. And since that term depression has more resonance in popular culture, it makes sense that extreme risk would not be Star Trek's big borderline personality disorder episode, right? Like, it makes sense that they would collect these indicators and then call it depression, right? Because far fewer people know what BPD is. But Dr. Rogers also felt like there was still likely an underlying borderline pathology causing Bolana to act this way. And so when she said that, the idea triggered my Kelpian threat ganglia. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why. So one of the things that led Dr. Rogers to suspect borderline personality disorder was that people with BPD are seen as emotionally unpredictable, grouchy, angry, etc. Well, my initial reaction to that was, okay, it could be BPD, or it could be that she's Klingon, right? So then I had to take a step back. Isn't it interesting that we have casually ascribed these psychological traits and characteristics to a particular race of people? Me saying, oh, well, she's just a Klingon, that rolled out way too easily. There is a pronounced Star Trek practice of doing this. There is a real racial element here. But in order to unpack it, we need to look a little deeper at the reality and the metaphor of race here. So let's talk for just a second about the difference between race as race and species as race, or space as race, if you will. That's only funny to me. It's fine. So let's start with race as race. The actor who plays Bolana, that's Roxanne Dawson, she identifies as being of Latin descent. There's an excellent Women at Warp episode where they talk about Roxanne Dawson's thoughts on how her human race might have impacted impacted her portrayal of Bolana, or maybe how her human race might have manifested in the character of Bolana. And so if you want a deeper dive on that, I would strongly encourage you to go check out that Women at Warp episode. I believe it is episode 86. So essentially, Roxanne Dawson felt like her human racial heritage didn't really matter as much as Bolana's Klingon heritage. And her Klingonness is what we should have been focusing on. And she points to Tuvok as an example, Tuvok, who is played by Tim Russ, who is Black. So she said, you know, Tim Russ is Black, but Tuvok is Vulcan. And no one cares that that essentially makes him a black Vulcan. He's just a Vulcan. And again, in that Women at Warp episode, they said, you know, that's a very Star Trek thing to do, right? To say, okay, well, yeah, he's different because he's Vulcan, but, you know, it's the future and we don't really care about race anymore. So, you know, pay no attention to the fact that he's black. Maybe racism isn't a thing on Vulcan because racism is inherently illogical. So there's that. But if there's an episode where they come right out and say this, I haven't seen it. So it is a very Star Trek thing to do, but it's still a little bit of a scam, right? Regardless of Tuvok's heritage, Tim Russ is black, and the audience cannot help but read him in that way. So regardless of Bolana's heritage, Roxann Dawson is a woman of color, and the audience will read her character as such. Now, if we switch over to the space as race side of things, we know that Bolana is part human, part Klingon. Dozens of scholars before me have already done the work of drawing the connection between the Klingons and their likely sociocultural inspirations in human culture, right? So when you're designing a whole race of people and you decide, oh, okay, well, let's make them big and strong and violent and angry and just barely, quote unquote, civilized. And they also tend to be browner in complexion. I mean, I know this is Star Trek, but it's not rocket science, right? You can tell me all day long that we'll have racism solved by the 23rd or the 24th century. But unfortunately, the 20th and 21st century humans that created and watched these stories are still firmly under racism's evil spell. So there's no divorcing that lens with which we watch. So when we combine race as race and space as race, we see that this story about mental health is brought to us on the body of a woman of color. And it will be processed by an audience as being about a woman of color. And that message will chain out to being about women of color in general, no matter how you shake it. More on shaking later when we talk about Chicote. That's coming up. That's a terrible joke. All right. On the one hand, great. This is a very, very good thing. We need to hear more stories about the prevalence and severity of mental health conditions and care in the intersections. Shout out to the intersectional feminist who gave a great talk yesterday about intersectionality. So we need to be thinking more about this. So on the one hand, good. On the other hand, yikes, you just upped the stakes, right? It becomes that it becomes that much more important to get it right because you're impacting the way that real people think about each other and interact with each other and the world, right? So I want to take a little bit of time now to look closely at how the episode actually got it right. Now that we understand what the stakes are here, let's think about how the episode got it right and the places in which it fell apart a little bit for me, turning it into an episode that I would only prescribe with caution and only after a long discussion about the possible side effects. So I deeply appreciated the interaction between Captain Janeway and Bolana. So again, just in terms of the narrative of the episode, Bolana goes into the holodeck and she does this program that ends her in a coma, essentially. She's asleep for about 12 hours. She wakes up and learns that the doctor has called the captain basically to report this incident. So the captain comes in, Captain Janeway comes in and is talking with Bolana. And their interaction is probably my favorite part of this episode in terms of my need to hold it up as a prescription, right? So the doctor has already told Janeway everything that he found. And in this moment, Janeway comes in and she has to act as Bolana's commanding officer, right? She's her boss, basically. But she's also a mentor to Bolana, and she cares very deeply for her. It's not just a coworker kind of thing. So Janeway in this moment has to thread the tiniest needle. So she starts off by just kind of stating the facts or telling Bolana everything that she now knows about what Bolana has been doing, what behaviors have been observed, or what evidence they've collected about Bolana's condition. They don't say it in the episode, but if you've been watching chronologically, then you know that Janeway is kind of the perfect person to have this conversation with Bolana, because just 2 episodes prior, she had her own struggle, right, with her mental health, literally like episode 1, and then this is episode 3. So I appreciated very much that this episode created a space for Bolana where she had someone who could sympathize with her, not just empathize. I think Captain Janeway has a great deal of empathy, but sympathy is quite different. And so the fact that they allowed this place where the 2 of them could talk about this together, that was very meaningful to me. But again, there is still that power dynamic where Janeway's the captain and she's Bolana's boss. Aesthetically, the episode also gives us as the audience a number of cues, or clues even, for how we're encouraged to interpret this moment. So for one, as you see in this image here, Janeway and Bolana are in a medium close-up and close-up shots in their exchange in the scene. And that implies intimacy and a respect for Bolana's privacy, right? So the further away the camera is from this moment, the more, the louder it seems, right? The more broadcast it is. But we are allowed to kind of tune in on this very private moment between the 2 of them. The doctor is not even in this conversation. He's not even a part of this conversation. So doing so, I think, is very respectful, and it encourages us to be respectful of this moment as well. In terms of the sound in this scene, Janeway's volume is very careful, very measured. She's almost whispering in this moment, in this conversation, which again, I think honors Bolana's privacy. Her actual words, Janeway's actual words to Bolana are, she says, Bolana, I'm worried about you. If there's something wrong, I want to help. So Bolana has a sympathetic ally in her struggle, and you can tell that she wants to open up here. She almost does, but it is an almost, right? The open-ended structure of Janeway's reaction also leaves Bolana with the option to say, nothing's wrong, okay? Janeway doesn't buy it in that moment, but she also doesn't push it. And so this moment does not lead to Bolana's breakthrough, even though, in my opinion, I think Janeway does almost everything right here. She does what she could have or should have done. And because she doesn't push it, and she does leave that part open, it leaves room for the most obvious problem in the episode. And that would be our friend Chicote, who there's lots that we could say about Chicote, right? Oh, Chicote. So again, I would like to point you to the Bolana-centric episode of Women at Warp, because they do a fantastic job in that episode of explaining why Chicote's approach of, well, let me back up for a second for those who don't remember the episode. So what happens is Bolana is released from sickbay, and she's in her quarters, and Chicote comes in to check on her, right? And he's like, yeah, well, you know, why don't you just show me some of the programs that you've been running, like, and I can look at them, and if they're cool, then I'll go back and I'll say they're cool, and it'll be fine, and we can just, you know, just move on or whatever. So he basically tricks her into going to the holodeck and running a program. So she's trying to like be cute and put in a different program, but he physically grabs her arm and forces her into the room where this program is running, that is essentially the massacre of all of her friends and family, right? The Maquis. And so he drags her into it. And it is, when I say it's uncomfortable, it is really, really, really not okay. In that episode of Women at Warp, they do a great job of explaining why Chicote's approach of physically grabbing Bolana and dragging her into the center, like ground zero of her trauma, why that's probably not the best approach. So I'm not going to spend too much additional time on this point. I think it's pretty clear that perhaps a physical confrontation could be triggering and could do more harm than good. Dr. Rogers explained it like this. She said that the aggressive approach, and I quote, usually ends up making the person feel defensive, which leads them to retreating and shutting down emotionally, or it leads to feelings of guilt and shame, which could actually make them self-harm even more and or shut down so they don't have to re-experience a reaction like that. So I think suffice it to say, don't be Chicote in this scene. But Dr. Rogers also helped me soften a little bit on what was initially a very powerful, oh hell no, reaction to what Chicote did. She helped me see that, yeah, okay, let's consider Chicote's emotions and circumstances here too. So he discovers that his friend has been risking her life, and that realization, the realization of that moment, is terrifying for him, obviously, right? He doesn't know if Bolana has been out here trying to kill herself, and his reaction can be pretty clearly explained by fear, as being motivated by fear. So somehow within the narrative, it is this interaction that she has with Chicote that actually works. It is this moment with Chicote that actually gets her to open up to him and to start talking about what she's been going through. She says to him, if I sprain my ankle, at least I feel something. I'm not trying to kill myself. I'm trying to see if I'm still alive. And it's as if those were, I mean, that's exactly what Dr. Rogers described, right? So Chicote says to her, you know, you have to find a better way to deal with this. You think? I'm sorry, I'm being unnecessarily unfair to Chicote. But okay, so he says, like, you've got to find a better way to do this. And she says, I don't know how. And he says, we'll figure it out together. So, okay. So like Janeway, Chicote offers his support, but what that support is going to look like is not discussed. That's actually not discussed within the text. And that's really my biggest gripe with this episode. I love that the episode shows Bolana struggling privately and withdrawing from the things and the people that she loves and that love her. I love that the episode shows Bolana's community rallying around her. And I love that someone struggling with their own mental health could watch this episode and feel like, yes, I know I too have a community that could support me. That's great. All of that is fantastic. Her friends want to help. Her romantic partner loves her and wants to help. Her boss understands what she's going through and wants to help. All of this is wonderful. I also have to say that I appreciate that Voyager doesn't take the television bait of suggesting that the problem here is 100% resolved by the time our 48 minutes have elapsed. Bolana gets stronger and better by the end of the episode, but she does continue to struggle in later episodes of the show. This aspect of her story, I think, is incredibly powerful and important for a number of reasons. I don't know if you all are familiar with the podcast Depresh Mode, which is quite possibly the most perfectly named podcast. I'm super jealous at how perfect that name is for a podcast, but it's called Depresh Mode. So in that podcast, the host John Moe once said that he gets a lot of frustrated listeners giving him feedback because he will have these interviews with people and they present themselves as being, kind of on the other side of the mountain. And so for people listening in the audience, it can be like, well, that person got it together, so what's wrong with me, right? Like, why can't I get to that other side of the mountain? So in showing Bolana as better, but not quote unquote fixed, doing that is critical, right? It also shows loved ones that depression is not a one episode kind of thing. It's not, it becomes part of the new normal, right? That's part of your story now. But Voyager wasn't ready for the circumstances that led them to the Delta Quadrant, right? The ship did not have a ship's counselor, which was at that point a common thing to have. Voyager actually wasn't even scheduled to have a ship's counselor on board because it wasn't seen as necessary to their mission, which that's wild, right? So what deep space mission would not require the services of a counselor? I'm not sure about that part, but either way, they didn't have one on board. The closest thing they got was Neelix, who became the ship's morale officer, which is not a thing, right? He made that up. And also, I'm not trusting anyone's mental health with Neelix. I mean, no shade to Neelix. Well, no, a little bit of shade to Neelix, but like you could have a ship's counselor or you could have Neelix, and you should choose the ship's counselor, to be quite honest. So that leaves us with the doctor, who you see here, the EMH. So the yesterday I saw an incredible session from the folks from Into the Wormhole, and they suggested, the doctor could be programmed with a whole bunch of different kinds of therapy, right? He could fill that role of ship's counselor. I loved the idea that in addition to all of his, kind of medicinal knowledge that he has, he could also have a ton of different non-pharmacological approaches to treatment, right? Such as music therapy. And I love that idea, but it also, then now I have a new itch that I need to scratch, right? It makes me wonder why the EMH was not given that kind of program in the first place. We do know that he has sufficient psychological knowledge to note observational concerns, right? He obviously has enough knowledge in psychology to be able to diagnose Bolana with clinical depression. But at the same time, and I should also mention that the reason why we know that is because of an episode where he was playing around with his own personality subroutines, right? So he's got all of this medical knowledge, but he's unable to actually serve Bolana as the kind of professional that she definitely needs, especially when we look at how her indicators gathered, right? So we have to presume that the doctor does have a medicine-based, right, a pharmacological treatment for her. Side note, somewhat irrelevant, it's kind of interesting to think about the medical conditions that are considered cured or like easily treatable by the 24th century and the ones that remain a challenge. And I guess mental health is one of those things that even 24th century science continues to work on. But either way, Bolana's treatment, the way that Bolana moves forward in light of this diagnosis of depression, her treatment is not discussed, not as a plan, not as an option. So we're left to just say, okay, this is what the doctor thinks. Good luck, right? Okay. It's really the lack of a plan that I find most disturbing. This episode does an excellent job of showing the audience that someone with depression likely has more support than they think they do, right? But my own experiences with my loved ones and all of the research that I have done suggests that recognizing support is important. That is an important part of the puzzle, but realizing your resources might be the key, right? It's great to have support. You have to have it. It's even better to have support and resources. And this might be the most significant way in which this episode fails Bolana. So let's put it into a little bit of a hypo spray, shall we? So the whole point of my show is being able to recommend or prescribe television to help us through what ails us. That's what I'm attempting to do with the TV doctor. In general, I think that this episode got it mostly right with Janeway and mostly wrong with Chicote. And the doctor falls in the some good, some bad category, mostly because we don't get clear on the topic of the necessity of support and resources. Now, here's the thing. I'm a rhetorician, so it's not enough for me to focus only on what the story says. That's not enough. I do that as well, but I also think that it's important that we learn from the story itself and also take the additional step higher and ask ourselves about what this program, what this medium of television itself, what is this whole thing trying to teach us or show us or convince us of by telling us this story and telling it in this way. There is motive and intention behind the shows that are selected to reach audiences. And those shows and messages are little micro manipulations of the power dynamic. With Star Trek, a lot of it is beautiful, but we definitely owe it to ourselves to stay vigilant and stay critical. It's pretty much the only way that we can move forward. Okay, so I definitely want to come out of this presentation and see what's been going on in the chat and answer some questions for you all. So if you've been thinking about it, or if you've already just put tons of questions into the chat, I would love to see those. And I would also really, really love for you all to stay in touch with me. If you could follow me on Instagram, I'm at TEEVEEPHD. I'm also on Twitter at the exact same address. And you can send me an email to mfoss@thetvdoc.com. Specifically, if you have a situation, if you've got something that's going on in your life and you would love to have me prescribe some television for you, chances are very good that it will be a Star Trek episode. But I'm also, fluent in other television programs. Send me an email to mfoss@thetvdoc.com. And if you're looking for some more fun information, Bonus material, if you want some merch, you can go to thetvdoc.com. There's a fun little website there. All right, so I'm going to come out of that presentation, and hopefully I can see what kind of questions you all have. All right. Okay, so, oh, thank you for saying you love the TV doctor. I love you all too. You would have loved to write your thesis on something related to Star Trek. Well, still do. Do that anyway. Because I have to, listen, I have 10 different ideas. I'm like, oh, I could have written on that. Oh, I could have written on that. So I just write it anyway. Even if I don't do anything with it, I still do it. Okay, Susan says, this conversation never happens and needs to about race versus species. Yeah, that's an interesting thing, right? It is so woven into what Star Trek does, this race versus species concept. And one of my mentors, who didn't even know she was my mentor, Dr. Leah Vandenberg, wrote a really incredible article about this idea of species versus race, and how species is just a metaphor for race. And her focus was on Worf. So that's an interesting conversation to have for sure. Okay, understanding that comprehensive, Jara says, understanding that comprehensive mental health services in real life are not accessible to all. Still want to encourage anyone who might feel triggered by this discussion to reach out. In Canada, you can contact Crisis Services Canada or access a resource on their website, and US info is in the scroll. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, absolutely. The importance of these resources, and that's, again, that kind of goes back to what my show is really about, is helping us start to think about these things and then hunting them down in real life, right? So having the conversation begin in that televisual space, but then taking it into the real world. So this information is incredibly important. Thank you so much. And Susan says, hold Chicote to account. I'm not being unnecessarily unfair. He deserves it. He does. But I also felt a little like, okay, we also need to acknowledge that he's got feelings in this situation. And, for those of us who have watched a friend or a loved one struggle with depression, you can kind of understand how you would want to do that, right? You're scared, you feel unable to help in any meaningful way. And your reaction in that moment might be to just kind of want to grab that person. But it's very, very important, I think, for us to recognize that that's could end up doing more harm than good. And as he says, you've got to find a different way. He needed to find a different way. That's my opinion on that one. Louise says, yeah, in my experience, when you get to the other side of the mountain, there's another bloody mountain, right? And so I think that hearing other people discuss how there's another mountain after the mountain is so important. I think the episode does, it does a little bit of the, like, we get to the end of the episode and ta-da, we have banana pancakes and everything's fine. It does do a little bit of that, which is disappointing. It's a hard one to get around, right? Because on the one hand, it's fantastic to have this conversation. It's a good thing to have this conversation and to see that there are other people who are struggling in the same way that you might be feeling like you're struggling. At the same time, when we get to the end of the episode, and there's also a moment where after she's had this incredibly vulnerable moment with Chicote in the holodeck, there's this emergency, right? And gosh, what they really need is a good engineer, a good creative, ready to be productive engineer. And Chicote grabs his things and he's like, well, I guess I'm going to go. And so he heads off to do it. And Bolana comes flying up to him and she's like, no, I can definitely do this. I want to do it. something in that scene rang a little uncomfortable for me as well, because she definitely needed and wanted to have the time to process this realization that she had just come to, or this she was basically an open and very raw, just one nerve in that moment, and then she has to jump back in. It felt frustrating to me that I mean, I see this is something that is asked of women in general. Like, this is what you're going through in your life, cool, but can you just really kick in and become productive again? So yeah, thank you. Blog Track says, I wish it would have been more of a solo exploration. Most with depression don't have adequate support and must find resolution on their own while presenting as normal and happy. Agreed, right? So I think they do spend kind of the first part of the episode really kind of allowing Bolana to go through this on her own and having it be her own journey. And then in the episode Lineage, there's also a good amount of individual things that are an individual journey that she takes. But I think it was good that Star Trek really showed not only how she did have that support, but maybe how she kind of navigated reaching out to each of those different worlds that she was a part of, right? So her employment, if you will, through Janeway, her relationship with Paris, and then her friendships with Chicote, and I guess Neelix, although I don't know if I would say that Neelix and Bolana were like friends before this episode. There's no like buddy episode between the two of them, so I don't know. Okay, Jera says, I have a question. If you watch Discovery and/or Picard, I watch both. Any thoughts on how mental health or illness is treated in the newer Trek series outside of the constraints of the episodic format? Well, that's a lovely question. I think, you know, what's interesting is that I have seen a lot of information lately about Michael Burnham and being very interested in how she processes things. As a matter of fact, I feel like I saw somebody, I don't remember which show it was, forgive me, but somebody yesterday was talking about this as well, how I would like to see you keep it together as well as Michael Burnham does in light of everything that she is going through, right? So that is not something that I have studied yet, but now that's on my radar. If I had a pen closer to me, I would be writing that down. So thank you for that question. That's a really interesting one. Again, Blog Trek says, in my own headcanon, I like to think that they can't solve mental illness in the 24th century because it's not just rooted in biology, but something that is reinforced socially and cognitively. Absolutely, right? So it kind of goes back to what I was saying about racism. Like, I guess Star Trek has solved, you know, we live in the Star Trek world, we live in a world where, or in a universe, I guess, where racism has been eradicated along with poverty and, you know, those kind of things. And yet they still persist, just in other forms. So I feel like it's linked to that as well. We have eradicated part of the problem, but the rest is just inherent to who we are as a species. And apparently all the other species have that same issue. All right. Okay, let's see. Sorry, that just advanced. Haley says, I'm wondering if there is a relationship between mental illness and monstrosity as it is presented in the show, especially with the historical underpinnings of women of color in health context. For sure. And that's kind of what I was talking about when I said that, you know, each different species has, well, it doesn't happen for everybody, right? But a lot of the Star Trek species have these psychological traits that are attributed to them or linked to them. And for some species, that's a great thing, you know, like the Vulcans are so logical, good for them. And then for others, like Klingons, Ferengi jump right to the top of my mind as well. Those are unflattering, quote unquote, unflattering aspects. So that linking those to the idea of monstrosity, I think, is a clear relationship, and again, something that would be really exciting to explore. Jameson says, would this episode have had more or less of an impact if it had not provided a specific diagnosis? Well, now that, I really like that question a lot, right? So what would the dominoes have been if we didn't have that medical voice, right? If we didn't have the doctor coming in saying, this is literally clinical depression, right? So if the doctor had not used those words, I think a lot of those moments still would have presented and been interpreted by the audience as exactly what we were thinking, right? Again, those of us with a little more knowledge and training in psychology, like Dr. Rogers, probably would have read it as, either BPD or as depression. But I think where it gets really interesting and really crunchy is at that next level that I said, right? So there's like what would happen within the story, but then there's the other level of what does this mean to us as the audience? And I wonder if that is where it would have really come alive, right? So if they had not provided a specific diagnosis, what do we as the audience take from that? It becomes much more of a buffet where you kind of just take what you like and what you know from the episode, and maybe it loses some of the impact in terms of my purposes as being able to prescribe this for a certain situation. Maybe it loses some of its impact if they had done it that way. That's a really cool question. Let's see. I feel like Jera says, I feel like that's how they show Janeway breaking out of her depression too in Night, basically going back to work and being useful, right? Oh, and I just, there's something I can't quite crack about that. I desperately in that moment wanted them to leave Bolana alone and let her process this really heavy conversation that she had just had with Chicote. But they needed her, right? And she had to jump in and be productive. And what was even stranger about this in this episode, and maybe this is the part that I can't quite chew all the way through, but Chicote was like, you're good, I've got it, right? But it was Bolana who was written to basically force him to let her go and do the thing. So instead of her coming out and saying, hey, do you need me? And him being like, no, it's cool. You need to take a second. We've got it. And he does say that, but it's kind of like, no, you need a second. Like it's a little paternal in that moment. And it doesn't feel like this is my friend who's looking out for me. It's like, oh, do you need a moment? Like you need a second kind of thing, which is not, I don't like that. I'm trying. I want to tell my friend, Dr. Rogers, that I'm trying to give Chicote a little bit, but I just keep falling. I just keep falling into this trap of like, oh, I don't like that. I don't like that part of the episode. Okay, Jameson says, if you were to rewrite this episode, would you maintain the more problematic elements like Chicote's response while highlighting their problematic nature, or focus more on Janeway's response and care? Okay, so thank you for that question. I think that I even though as much as I dislike Chicote's response, I think it is appropriate to show as a possible response, a type of a way that people in your life may respond, right? Or a way that you might be thinking or feeling. So I think getting rid of it could end up coming off preachy. And that turns people off as well. That closes people down. So I think the assertiveness, maybe I'll say, of the episode, I would keep that. But I think I definitely would remove the fact that he is physical with her, that he puts his hands on her. I would change that part. but thank you for that. Okay, and then Jara says, okay, I reflected and that's not exactly accurate. In that case, it's more seeing that she has her entire crew behind her. Oh, that's maybe referring to your earlier question about maybe wanting it to be, or maybe from Night, from the episode Night. But I'm gonna skip down. Jara also says, feeling useful is super important for many people and that's valid. But it can also be dysfunctional if it's easier for someone who's struggling to just stay busy versus taking time to take care of themselves and feel their feels. Yeah, right. So like I think what we would wish for everybody in that situation is that they get exactly what they need and they are not forced into anything that could be damaging or less than helpful. But that she's not in an environment where she is allowed that kind of a moment, right? They really did need her. Had it been up to Chicote, and this is not just because I'm shading Chicote right now, but in that moment on the Delta Flyer, Chicote was not going to come up with that moment where she basically does a MacGyver and puts bubble gum and a phaser and creates a force field. Chicote wasn't going to come up with that. So, all right. Then Kennedy says, I wonder if Chicote was rough with Bolana because he knew she would respond to it because of her Klingon side and Maquis origins. Because she was definitely keeping the Doctor and Janeway at bay, despite how gentle and supportive they were, not making excuses, just offering an explanation because his roughness was cringe for sure. Right. So I think we might excuse Chicote a little bit for doing that because, you know, he's like, all right, I'm going to get in here with this Klingon. And also we have a Maquis shortcuts, right? We have shortcuts with each other and we know that we can just get right down to it. Yeah, it was, it was definitely cringe. But again, I think I'm starting to understand a little bit more about what was motivating Chicote. But, you know, interestingly, he's not really like that in so many other aspects of his life. We've seen several different instances where he's been incredibly tender and very gentle and very thoughtful and very intentional. And in this scene, it just seems like, or in this episode, it seems like he just did not do the right thing for the most part. All right. And then I'll do this last question. My friend Sarah and I would like to know what you think of Bolana's actual depiction of depression. I want to say this, and this is actually a perfect way to end this episode. I think that I think that Roxann Dawson did an incredible job of acting in this episode. I think the way that everything about her performance rang very authentic to me. It felt like Bolana was dealing with depression to me. And the problems that I really have with the episode are twofold. One being the support system. My issues are not really with Bolana. My issues are with the characters that are around her. And two, again, I feel like there's something is rough. Excuse the pun, but there's something that's rough about the connection to her Klingonness. The fact that she is, Dr. Rogers said, well, unpredictable and moody and angry. And I'm like, that's a Klingon. Klingons are just like that. So there's something unresolved about that part of it for me that I would need to dig a little deeper on. But in general, I think Roxann Dawson did an amazing job with this performance. And the episode in general is a good one that I ultimately would recommend. So again, I want to say thank you so much to the women at Warp. You are all admirals and beyond in my mind. So I would love for you all to live long and prosper and enjoy the rest of the IDIC Festival. Take care.